the central feature of the internal structure of the empire, which is recorded in history textbooks as Ancient Egypt, is that the pharaoh is the owner of the entire population of the empire. That being the case, his subjects at the same time are his slaves. A huge harem was the least that the pharaoh could afford. Now, on flip side of history, we'll tell you about Ancient Egypt and the role of pharaoh in its hierarchy. So let's continue this episode. Stay with us. History and significance of harems in Egypt. Pharaohs were considered intermediaries of the gods. Everything related to their lives was sacralized. Sexual relations were no exception. Their details were perceived by the general public as sacred deeds. In the ancient times, male sexuality was defined by the priestly class as a tool for maintaining power over this or that state. A striking instance, in the harems of Pharaoh Ramses II, there were about 40 concubines and wives, and every year he added new women. As a result, 1,000 women in the harems. As later in the Celestial Empire, female sexual energy was a battery, a source of charge for male rulers. Accordingly, the more there were representatives of the weaker sex, the more powerful the sacred battery was, in this case, the pharaoh. Now you understand what an important function the women's territory played in the court of the sovereign. The history of the harems of the Nile Valley goes back to more trite antiquity, in the years when there was no single state of Egypt, but there were separate chiefdoms, which united only in the 4th millennium BC into two kingdoms, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. It will take even longer before they merge into a single power of the pharaohs. Harems already existed in each of them. The ruler of each of them married the daughters of the princelings subordinate to him, as well as concubines, wives, sisters, and daughters of tribal leaders who didn't want to swear allegiance to the master. In principle, this method of maintaining power of an administratively complex location worked everywhere on the Egyptian territory. Roughly speaking, some of the women were initially hostages, who were allowed to call the master not husband but brother, but it still somehow made them his relatives. After all, among the Egyptians, brother and sister could marry, and it was acceptable. It was only with the strengthening of the legitimacy of the rulers of both Egypts that the legend of the taming of the wild feminine energy was born, about the need to replenish the viceroy's creative accumulator with this very power. The peasant was now revered as the only legitimate world builder. The Egyptians represented the female hypostasis as the lioness Sekhmet, and only after becoming part of the harem, the natural electricity stabilized to the state of a calm cat, Bastet. Spiritual explanations dominated worldview in ancient Egypt, and it affected virtually every aspect of life. The father of history, Herodotus, described a festival dedicated to the cat goddess, which took place in the city of Bubastis, the main center of the cult of this cat woman. When the Egyptians go to Bubastis, they do the following. Women and men sail there together. Both sexes are present on each boat. Some women have tools for noise. Some of the men play musical instruments along the way. The rest sing songs and applaud. Upon arrival in Bubastis, they celebrate with various sacrifices. During this celebration, much more drinks are drunk than during the rest of the year. Life and struggle inside of the harem. After that, no reader will be surprised that, unlike the autocracy of the East, women had much more rights in the harems of North Africa. After all, they are the exercise of men. Moreover, after this stage of the lioness, Sekhmet, and the cat, Bastet, the energy turned into love, Hator. In the women's side, in the hall with the pharaoh, only the eldest wife lived. Further in the palace complex lived the younger queens, in fact, all the other wives. And then there's other women. Others are just concubines, very beautiful young girls. It was they who were recognized as the direct servants of Hator. Their fate is to continuously revive the life forces and sexual energy of the ultimate master, namely Pharaoh, through all kinds of sexual actions or sexual rituals. We will talk about them later. Dressed in the most exquisite linen garments, they were adorned with beaded nets and an intricate belt around the hips. By the way, about the life of the harem, the great Pharaoh Ramses II had 111 sons and 67 daughters, and all of them were from his wives and concubines. The descendants of Ramses are members of the ruling clan, but each of them had to be recognized first. The beauties of the harem in the heyday of the empire were specifically natives of all the areas known to Egypt. The concubines were entrusted with the cultural program. They sang, were playing string instruments, they danced, played senet, the ancient Egyptian likeness of checkers, with the king. They even could delve into philosophy. The lady who was the eldest wife of the ruler is the main wife of the leader of the whole Egyptian state, and at the same time the owner of everything and everyone. She had the same power as himself. This lady could make important state decisions, but of course, as in any state, there were those who didn't like it. That is why inside the seraglio of the great country of Kemet, the bloody undercover intrigues did not subside, the participants of which were the supreme beloved, main wife, and again, the supreme eunuch and the supreme priest. The Trinity has always fought with each other for the right to influence the King of Kings in their own favor. But don't write off the rivalry within the team of the halves of the Viceroy of the Gods. Even the younger ones, if at least one of them stood out in the eyes of the master as a favorite one. During the confrontation, every method could be used: poison, dagger, slander, all sorts of accusations of betrayal, and accusation of a sinful behavior. Sexual rituals and ceremonies inside the harem. Obviously, the main duty of women was to participate in rituals and ceremonies of replenishment of power for the potency of the King of Kings. For his strength was considered the power of the life-giving land, and at the same time the power of everything else in the two united kingdoms of Kemet. Speaking of the confessional culture inside the palace, or sexual rites, let's start with the fact that everyone here could walk fully naked. Only the Viceroy of the Gods had to have at least a royal regalia on his head, a headdress with a cape, ubris. The ladies were not shy of the gentlemen. Being naked in a public place was something totally natural, as we are told in the wall paintings of the buildings of ancient Egypt. Love impulses and almost full absence of shyness were natural in many places here. In this regard, one should not think that the personal life of the pharaoh was behind 7 seals. Let us remind you that any activity of the pharaoh was part of the religion of his subject slaves. Therefore, over time, part of his life, including intimate, turned into rituals of a public nature. These were even intimate acts which, according to legend, were supposed to ensure the fertility and well-being of the country. Don't forget that in very distant times, intimate contact was symbolized with the sowing of crops in the agricultural societies, and the society in the lower reaches of the Nile was almost fully agrarian. For one instance, naked courtiers of any gender and age could closely observe the intercourse of the same naked pharaoh with different women. Yes, if only they were just women and not younger sometimes. Exactly. Intimate hairstyles, gentle touching, and striptease dancing were ancient Egyptian know-how, as well as, apparently, circumcision. It is also depicted in the pictures of the buildings of the country of Kemet. Only bed affairs aimed at conception were accompanied by a very strictly defined ceremony. Firstly, suitable days were calculated according to the calendar, if being more precise, days of Nile fluting. Practically no one have never done this after a session of alcohol poisoning, that is, in the middle and after the holidays. The main purpose of all rites and rituals was to maintain the erection of the sovereign. This was done by all the women present at the place of intimate contact, and not only the one who is the symbol of the womb of the earth, the one with whom the pharaoh copulated. This is evidenced by figurines, various carvings, and other images. And yes, in every place of the state there were branches of the seraglio. The pharaoh could perform the ritual in every city on the map. How did the intimacy with the pharaoh happen? Despite the fact that sexual pleasure is part of leisure, the process of conception had a strict algorithm. The meaning of sexual intercourse inside the harem was more important than sexual intercourse outside of it. Well, the participation of at least one of the sisters was mandatory. Incest in the land of pharaohs was considered sacred, and oral caresses. According to myths, Isis brought Osiris back to life by touching her lips. We pointed out that helpers were also needed to support the back or buttocks during intercourse. Such a group tradition apparently comes from the pre-pharaonic period. In the frescoes, sexual acts are presented as a composition not only of the spouses but also of the other inhabitants of the hut. The end of the harem era. Instead of a conclusion, we've decided to add this chapter. The seraglios of Egypt tended to disappear after the case of Ramses III. They finally disappeared at the same time as the religion that deified the pharaohs. From the 5th century BC, the population worshipped the more popular ancient Greek pantheon, which meant to become monogamous. Cleopatra did try to return the traditions of Egypt, and she partially succeeded, but not a harem traditions and rites. That is it for now. Thank you for watching, and in case if you liked the episode, leave a like and subscribe, and we'll see you later in upcoming episodes.